On a peaceful Sunday morning in 1941, the Hawaiian island of Oahu appeared as serene and picturesque as it always had. The recent relocation of the United States Pacific Fleet from San Diego to its new base at Pearl Harbor seemed to symbolize nothing more than America's expanding naval power. Moored alongside Ford Island were 7 of the nation's most formidable battleships, positioned together in what would later become famously known as Battleship Row. The impressive display of these seemingly invincible warships made it easy to believe that no force could ever threaten America's military might. But as the morning sun steadily rose, both in the sky and as a symbol of what was to come, it exposed a vast formation of aircraft speeding overhead toward a moment that would forever change history. This is the story of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Welcome to Wars of the World. As the 20th century dawned, the great European empires continued to dominate much of the globe. While emerging powers such as Germany, the United States, and Japan were rapidly expanding their industrial and military capabilities, there was little unclaimed territory left for them to seize. Of all the rising nations, Japan was perhaps the most underestimated in the early 1900s. It had already established itself as a significant power in the Far East. Yet Western arrogance and racial prejudice often led European countries to dismiss Japan as no serious threat to their interests, particularly in China, where the Western powers generally maintained the advantage. That view, however, began to change after May 27, 1905. Japan had gone to war with one of the oldest and most powerful empires in history: Imperial Russia. On the open ocean, the stage was set for a decisive naval confrontation that would determine the balance of sea power. Throughout the conflict, nearly every leading military commander believed the Russian Navy would easily overwhelm the independent Japanese fleet. Instead, to the world's complete surprise, Japan not only defeated the Russian fleet, but almost completely destroyed it, while suffering only minor losses of its own. The impact of this remarkable victory reached far beyond what most people realized in 1905, though its true importance became clear in the years that followed. For the first time in the modern age, an Asian empire had defeated a European empire. The defeat badly damaged Russia's international prestige, weakened its influence across Europe, contributed to the tensions that led to the First World War, and eventually helped pave the way for the Russian Revolution. For Japan, however, this victory filled the nation with confidence, and the military gained an even more important place within Japanese society. Inspired by the traditional ideals of the samurai and the warrior's code, Japan continued expanding its armed forces while embracing the newest military technologies, believing that technological superiority had been the key to defeating Russia. Japan's latest warships matched, and in some cases even outperformed, those built by Europe's leading naval powers. When Japan joined the Allies during the First World War, its warships sailed into the Mediterranean to fight Germany, where they earned both admiration and concern from European naval commanders. Japanese soldiers also carried out successful campaigns against German territories across Asia, further strengthening Japan's reputation as one of the world's leading military powers. However, after the war ended, Japan realized it still was not treated as an equal among the world's greatest powers. On top of that, the major nations introduced a series of arms limitation agreements to stop another global war. But these restrictions strongly favored Britain and the United States. At sea in particular, Japan's navy faced strict limits on the number and size of ships it could build, compared to London and Washington, who claimed they needed larger fleets because they had bigger empires to defend. By then, Japan had already set its sights on creating a powerful modern Asian empire, with Japan firmly at its center. The more aggressive groups within Japanese society were now determined to take advantage of the opportunity created by the exhausted European and American powers, expanding outward while facing little risk of interference unless they directly challenged them. The economic crisis that struck Japan during the late 1920s only strengthened the militarist demands for expansion to secure valuable resources overseas, including oil and strategic metals, both of which Japan had very limited natural supplies. Two major strategies emerged for building this new empire. The first was called the Northern Plan, which proposed invading China through Manchuria before advancing into the Soviet Union, where the Japanese army hoped to capture the oil-rich lands of Siberia. Army leaders strongly supported this plan because, as a land campaign, it promised greater government funding and resources. They also viewed communism as one of Japan's greatest enemies and believed the Western nations, who also distrusted communism, would likely ignore the invasion or possibly even support Japan. The alternative strategy, known as Nanshin-Ron, looked toward Southeast Asia and the many Pacific Islands as natural areas for Japanese expansion if they could benefit the empire. Supported by the Japanese Navy, this approach created greater challenges during the early 1930s because it risked putting Japan into direct conflict with Britain, France, and the Netherlands, all of which controlled territories in the region, along with the United States and the Philippines. Both strategies were pursued to different extents throughout the 1930s. Although the Southern Plan moved forward more cautiously than the Army's Northern Plan, Japan increased its influence in the South by establishing various Japanese companies that built facilities appearing commercial but clearly capable of future military use. Meanwhile, across the Sea of Japan, the Japanese Empire had already gained control of Taiwan after the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and officially annexed the Korean Peninsula in 1910. Japan was now ready to begin the first stage of the Northern Plan by occupying Manchuria in northeastern China, a region that would strengthen both its military and economy while providing a launching point for a future war against the Soviet Union. However, they needed a believable excuse before invading. To create one, the Japanese staged an attack on a railway line in Manchuria that was used by Japanese workers living there. Known as the Mukden incident, a small bomb exploded on the railway on September 18, 1931, planted by the Japanese themselves before they blamed the attack on Chinese terrorists. The explosion was so weak that it failed to damage the tracks, and trains continued running almost immediately afterward. Even so, Japan reacted without delay, sending troops into Manchuria under the claim of protecting Japanese citizens from these supposed terrorists. Although the Chinese forces defending Manchuria greatly outnumbered the invaders, they were completely outmatched. Within just 6 months, the region had fallen under Japanese control and was turned into the puppet state of Manchukuo. International criticism followed quickly, especially after a League of Nations investigation exposed the truth behind the bombing. This left Japan increasingly isolated on the world stage. Even so, the League of Nations did little more than issue formal protests to Tokyo. Before the invasion of Manchuria, China was already caught in a bitter civil war, with the nationalists and the communists fighting each other for control. But once Japanese troops entered Chinese territory, both sides agreed to pause their conflict and instead unite against Japan's advancing forces. The fighting continued for months and eventually years after the railway bombing. At first, China received important military support from the Soviet Union. Soon after, the United States also began providing assistance, while officially remaining neutral, even as it continued selling large amounts of scrap metal to Japan, which was then recycled into weapons and military equipment. As the war across China grew more intense, it became clear that Japan held both a technological and tactical advantage over the Chinese forces, especially in the skies. Because of this, China searched around the world for experienced military pilots who could train Chinese aviators to fly the newer aircraft they were receiving, particularly those built in America. One of those pilots was Robert Macaulay Short, who arrived in China to demonstrate the Boeing 218 biplane fighter. But after witnessing Japan's brutal actions firsthand and seeing the international community do very little in response, he chose to join the fight himself in February 1932. That day, he flew his more advanced aircraft against 3 Japanese Navy fighters launched from the carrier over Shanghai. Although he damaged the lead aircraft, all 3 Japanese fighters escaped his attack by turning back toward their carrier. On the ground, however, the situation for the Chinese had become increasingly desperate. Then, on February 22, the squadron flying alongside Short was ordered to move to an airfield in Nanking. Since his aircraft was faster than the Chinese planes, Short decided to leave ahead of the group and fly there alone. During the journey, he spotted 3 Imperial Japanese Navy B-1M bombers. Diving in at high speed, Short opened fire, heavily damaging the lead bomber and sending it crashing to the ground. But he failed to notice the agile A-1N fighters escorting the bombers, which quickly attacked from behind and fatally damaged his Boeing 218. Witnesses below watched as the aircraft burst into flames before crashing southeast of the city of Suzhou. Some accounts even claimed that the Japanese pilots flew over the wreckage afterward, with at least one offering a salute to the fallen American. Although Short fought as a private citizen rather than an official member of the U.S. military. Many believe he became both the first American pilot to shoot down a Japanese aircraft and the first American killed during aerial combat between the United States and Japan. On May 22, 1933, Japanese and Chinese representatives met to negotiate a ceasefire, effectively giving Japan control of Manchuria along with large parts of northern China. It was a major victory for the Japanese Empire. However, the dispute also led Japan to withdraw from the powerless League of Nations, which strongly criticized Japan's actions, but ultimately did very little to stop them. Even as reports of Japanese brutality against Chinese prisoners and civilians spread across the world, fighting continued along China's borders in the years that followed. Most of these clashes were carried out by anti-Japanese resistance groups, especially those loyal to the Chinese Communists. Then, on the night of July 7, 1937, Chinese and Japanese troops exchanged gunfire near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing. The exact reason for the clash remains uncertain, but it most likely began because of confusion combined with rising tensions between soldiers on both sides. Within moments, the skirmish exploded into a full-scale battle. Encouraged by the fighting, Chinese troops serving under Japanese command turned against their former rulers, attacking Japanese soldiers and civilians while setting Japanese property on fire. Furious over the violence directed at Japanese civilians, Japan quickly sent reinforcements from the home islands to crush the rebellion, and the Second Sino-Japanese War officially began. The fighting that followed reached levels of brutality rarely seen in modern warfare. The Japanese forces showed little mercy, and civilians were never spared. As every town, village, and city fell into Japanese hands, waves of murder, destruction, and sexual violence followed. The worst atrocities came when Japanese forces advanced toward the Chinese capital of Nanking. The suffering inflicted upon the people of the city, whose population had grown rapidly as refugees poured in from already occupied areas, is almost impossible to put into words. From young children to the elderly, no one was spared as Japanese commanders appeared to lose control over their troops. In her book The Rape of Nanking, historian Iris Chang wrote, "If one event can be held up as an example of the unmitigated evil lying just below the surface of unbridled military adventurism, that moment is the Rape of Nanking." As Britain, the United States, and other Western nations held important interests throughout China during the 1920s and 1930s, they watched with growing concern as the country descended first into civil war and then into conflict with Japan after the invasion of Manchuria. Although they remained largely neutral throughout most of the fighting, they still believed it was necessary to deploy military forces to protect their citizens and interests. British troops, for example, fought several clashes against hostile groups labeled as bandits, though many of these fighters were actually members of the Chinese Communist forces resisting foreign imperial influence rather than ordinary criminals. Along the strategically important Yangtze River, both the Royal Navy and the United States Navy operated fleets of river gunboats, whose main mission was protecting merchant ships from their own countries traveling along the river's 3,900-mile route. It was an extremely dangerous assignment, with snipers from different factions often hiding along the riverbanks, waiting for the chance to shoot unsuspecting sailors standing on deck. One vessel serving with the American Asiatic Fleet in this risky role was the US Panay, carrying a crew of 59 officers and sailors. Built in China in 1927, the ship spent much of the 1930s escorting vessels along the Yangtze, where gunfire directed at it became almost an everyday event. Even so, one of the ship's commanding officers, Lieutenant Commander R.A. Dyer, once remarked, "The Chinese appear to be rather poor marksmen, and the ship has so far not sustained any casualties in these engagements." Japan's full-scale invasion of China in 1937 dramatically changed the situation, raising fears that Japanese aircraft might accidentally identify the American gunboat as a Chinese vessel and attack it. To reduce that risk, the Panay began sailing with large American flags spread clearly across the top of the ship for easy identification. In December 1937, as Japanese forces closed in on the doomed Chinese capital of Nanking, American and British gunboats, including the Panay, were sent to help evacuate their embassies. Carrying American embassy staff and civilians, the Panay joined 3 American merchant ships and on December 12 moved upriver as the fighting grew more intense, hoping to avoid the battle. American officials had already informed Japan that the vessel was operating in the area. Even so, Japanese aircraft received orders to attack every ship they found on the Yangtze River. At around 1:27 p.m. local time, Japanese Navy planes launched their assault. 2 130-pound bombs struck the American gunboat, while Japanese fighters repeatedly swept in, firing machine guns at the ship. By 3:54 p.m., the Panay had sunk. 4 people were killed, including the captain of one of the merchant ships, while many others were injured before being rescued by the British gunboats Ms. Ladybird and Ms. B, along with another American gunboat, the ominously named Oahu. The attack happened almost exactly 4 years before the strike on Pearl Harbor. At the same time, American missionaries documented the horrifying scenes unfolding around them. They witnessed men being tortured and murdered, while countless women and young girls suffered rape and were killed with bayonets. The true death toll of the Nanking Massacre remains fiercely disputed between Chinese and Japanese sources, with estimates ranging from about 30,000 to nearly 500,000 victims. American businesses and property also became targets during the widespread looting and destruction carried out by Japanese troops. However, after the Panay incident, Japanese commanders became more careful in how their soldiers treated American officials. When John Moore Allison, a consul at the American embassy, was struck across the face by a Japanese soldier, Japanese authorities quickly issued an apology. Yet many Americans saw the incident as an insult to their nation, strengthening the belief that if Japan remained unchecked, it would continue expanding until it eventually threatened the United States itself. Following the Nanking Massacre and the attacks on foreign citizens, ships, and buildings, public opinion in both Australia and the United States shifted sharply from indifference to strong opposition against Japan's war in China. Australian dockworkers refused to load Japanese ships carrying supplies used in the conflict, while Chinese communities across America raised money to support China's resistance and worked to bring attention to the suffering of their people. Once again, however, Tokyo ignored the growing international criticism, recognizing no authority above that of the emperor. At the same time, Japan continued building warships beyond the limits set by international treaties, raising serious concerns in Britain and the Netherlands, whose attention was already focused on the growing threat of Nazi Germany in Europe. Because the United States remained officially neutral, American companies continued making profits by selling weapons and supplies to both China and Japan, despite widespread public outrage over Japanese atrocities. On April 19, 1939, economist and foreign policy expert Maxwell S. Stewart told members of Congress that America's neutrality was little more than an illusion because the United States was effectively helping fuel Japan's war effort. Japanese bombers were built using American steel and powered by American oil, forcing many Americans to accept that their country shared some responsibility for the conflict. Since the creation of Manchukuo, Soviet and Japanese troops had repeatedly clashed in an undeclared border conflict. Then, on May 11, those skirmishes erupted into full-scale fighting. Known in Japan as the Nomonhan Incident, the conflict lasted until September 16, 1939. By the end, Japan's Sixth Army had been devastated, losing at least 8,000 soldiers. Although Soviet casualties were even higher, the Red Army successfully defended its border, achieving its main strategic objective. The defeat had a major impact on Japan's foreign policy, effectively ending support for the Northern Plan. Japanese leaders realized that even if their soldiers performed better individually, the Soviet Union could always send far greater numbers into battle than Japan could ever match. As a result, Tokyo began changing its strategy, eventually signing a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union in early 1941 to avoid another conflict. This allowed the Japanese army to concentrate on the war in China, while the Navy prepared to carry out the Southern Plan by force, if necessary. In September 1939, Europe was thrown into war after Nazi Germany launched its invasion. By June 1940, both France and the Netherlands had fallen, leaving their colonial territories in Southeast Asia and the Pacific exposed to Japanese expansion with very little resistance available to stop it. As Germany occupied France and negotiations between Tokyo and Berlin strengthened their partnership, Japanese troops invaded northern French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, on September 22, 1940. Their main goal was to cut off military supplies reaching China through the port of Haiphong. By September 26, Japan had secured control of the northern region. The following day, Japan officially joined Germany and Italy in forming the Axis powers. The news sent shockwaves through London and Washington, where leaders worried about what this new alliance might mean. Anticipating further Japanese expansion, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, to move the fleet's main base from San Diego to Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu as a warning against Japanese aggression toward American interests. Once again, the United States found itself struggling to balance neutrality with growing support for the nations opposing Nazi Germany, a feeling that now increasingly extended to Japan because of its alliance with Hitler. Diplomatic messages flowed between the governments as American and British leaders sought guarantees that Japan would not threaten Allied interests across the region. Instead, the situation continued growing worse. Believing it had no other option, the United States began tightening economic embargoes on Japan, restricting exports of important materials such as aircraft parts and scrap metal. While these measures weakened Japan's war industry, they failed to bring it to a halt. In June 1941, the Japanese army pushed into the southern part of Indochina. In response, the United States imposed a complete oil embargo on Japan the following month, cutting off a resource that Tokyo depended on heavily. Faced with this crisis, Japan turned its attention toward the oil-rich Dutch East Indies as a replacement for the American supply it had lost. Anticipating this move, President Franklin D. Roosevelt warned that the United States was prepared to respond if Japan carried out any further military expansion in the region. He also made it clear that Washington expected Japan to begin withdrawing from mainland Asia. But for Japan's politically powerful military leaders, that demand was completely unacceptable. While diplomats on both sides of the Pacific exchanged proposals and counterproposals in hopes of preventing a conflict, the Japanese military had already begun preparing for the possibility that relations with the United States would continue to collapse and eventually lead to war. Born on April 4, 1884, Isoroku Yamamoto graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at the age of 20, first specializing in naval gunnery, which remained the dominant force in naval warfare despite the arrival of newer weapons like submarines and torpedoes. After serving with distinction during the Battle of Tsushima, where he was wounded in combat, he quickly rose through the ranks and was selected for several important assignments in the then-friendly United States. There, he studied at the prestigious Harvard University and later served at the Japanese Embassy in Washington. Both his Japanese and American friends often commented on his love of gambling, earning him a reputation as a master of games of chance from both Eastern and Western traditions. Although his career had followed a fairly traditional path, Yamamoto was among the few military leaders during the early 1920s who truly understood the revolutionary potential of aircraft in modern warfare. The Japanese Navy acquired its first aircraft in 1910, and by 1922, it had commissioned its first aircraft carrier, the Heishi. Even so, like most navies around the world, Japan still viewed naval aviation mainly as a supporting arm for its powerful battleships. Determined to expand and modernize Japan's naval air force, Yamamoto shifted his focus to aviation in 1924. He first became head of the Aeronautics Department, before later taking command of the 1st Carrier Division. Helping accelerate the development of Japan's carrier fleet was a team of British pilots and engineers known as the Simple Mission. Officially backed by Britain, the mission aimed to benefit from Japan's plans to build a strong carrier fleet for operations across the Pacific. Since Japan had been an ally during the First World War, many believed it could never truly rival either the Royal Navy or the United States Navy under the leadership of Scottish nobleman Lord William Forbes Simple. British assistance included the sale of military aircraft, which inspired Japanese designers and helped launch Japan's own naval aviation industry. Although the official mission ended after only 18 months, an enormous amount of valuable technical knowledge had already been passed on to Japan. Even after the mission officially ended, Lord Simple secretly continued providing Japan with information about British military developments, despite violating Britain's Official Secrets Act. His actions were eventually uncovered, but his powerful political connections protected him from prosecution. Throughout the 1930s, he continued quietly supporting Japanese interests. Now serving as an admiral, Yamamoto understood that aircraft carriers alone were not enough during the 1930s to create the powerful naval striking force he envisioned. To strengthen that force, he ordered the development of a large fleet of twin-engine land-based torpedo bombers that could support the carriers until newer and more capable carrier aircraft became available. By 1940, thanks to the technical advantage gained through the Simple Mission and the strategic vision of leaders like Yamamoto, Japan had assembled the strongest naval aviation force anywhere in the world. It included 6 large fleet carriers, 3 smaller carriers, and 1 dedicated training carrier. Backed by massive land-based bomber units, Japan was finally capable of challenging its increasingly hostile former allies. Yet Yamamoto himself remained deeply cautious about fighting the British, French, Dutch, and especially the United States, particularly while Japan was still locked in a costly war across China. Yamamoto's deep understanding of the United States made him the ideal officer to design Japan's strategy for a possible war against America. But that same experience also gave him a clear understanding of the risks involved. When he compared the United States with Japan, he knew America held major advantages in both manpower and industrial strength. At first, America's focus on the growing war in Europe against Hitler's Germany would reduce some of that advantage, with much of the U.S. Navy already committed to operations in the Atlantic. But once war with Japan began, a large part of the Atlantic Fleet would quickly be transferred to the Pacific. Beyond that, America possessed an enormous industrial base that not only produced on a massive scale, but also depended far less on imported raw materials than Japan did. That meant submarines and air attacks would struggle to disrupt American production. Taking all of this into account, Yamamoto concluded that Japan would have only 6 months after the outbreak of war to cripple the United States in the Pacific, badly enough to force it into peace negotiations. If that happened, Japan could demand control of the Pacific, giving Tokyo the freedom to build its empire, known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and establish itself as the dominant power across Asia. He repeatedly warned that if Japan failed to achieve victory within 6 months, or at the absolute most 1 year, defeat would become almost certain. By then, he believed, American industry would be operating at full capacity, producing warships, aircraft, and weapons at a pace Japan could never hope to match. His cautious outlook was met with strong opposition from Japan's more politically powerful army leaders, who firmly believed in their nation's superiority and fighting spirit. As those generals continued pushing for war against the Western powers in Asia, Yamamoto had little choice but to begin planning for it. He knew the opening strike had to be overwhelming, giving Japan enough time to expand across the Pacific while facing as little resistance as possible. The Japanese Navy had already spent years considering how a war with the United States might unfold, and most of those plans centered on launching a massive invasion of the American-controlled Philippines. From there, the United States could threaten Japan's vital shipping routes and use the islands as a base to strike the expanding Japanese empire. Any successful campaign would require Japan to quickly defeat the American forces stationed there, allowing the islands to be heavily fortified and turned into a launching point for future operations against the U.S. Pacific Fleet after it sailed from its main base at Pearl Harbor. But Yamamoto believed this strategy would ultimately lead to disaster because it failed to eliminate the greatest threat early enough: the powerful American Navy, especially its battleships and aircraft carriers. Those warships would remain a constant danger throughout the campaign in the Philippines, forcing Japan into a prolonged naval war that would give the United States valuable time to fully mobilize its military and industry. Looking for another solution, Yamamoto began considering the bold and highly unconventional idea of launching a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. A successful strike there could destroy the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one devastating blow. While weighing this possibility, he received reports from Japanese naval officers stationed in Berlin and Rome describing a remarkable battle fought on the night of November 11, 1940. During the attack on Taranto Harbor, the British Royal Navy had launched an air assault from the aircraft carrier Miss Illustrious, using the seemingly outdated ferry Swordfish biplanes against the main Italian battle fleet anchored in the harbor. The Italians had believed the shallow water made aerial torpedo attacks impossible, and were confident any incoming aircraft would be spotted before causing serious damage. That night proved both assumptions completely wrong. Although the British attack did not sink the entire Italian fleet, it crippled enough major warships to remove them from the Mediterranean campaign for several months. This was exactly the kind of result Yamamoto hoped to achieve against the American fleet. Rather than fighting the U.S. Navy across the open Pacific, he argued for striking first while its ships remained anchored at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. His vision was far more ambitious than the British attack at Taranto. Yamamoto planned to use all 6 of Japan's large fleet carriers together with the country's newest fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo aircraft in a carefully coordinated assault. The first objective would be destroying the American aircraft defending the harbor, followed by the complete destruction of the battleships and aircraft carriers below. Japan's army leaders were not immediately convinced. They believed the carriers would be more useful supporting invasions of Burma, Manila, and the Philippines. They also feared that committing nearly 60% of Japan's carrier force to one operation was incredibly risky. If the Americans discovered and destroyed those carriers before or after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan could lose the war almost immediately. Yamamoto rejected those concerns, insisting that if the American fleet was not destroyed first at Pearl Harbor, Japan would lose the war no matter what alternative strategy it chose. In the end, his arguments prevailed, and preparations for the attack on Pearl Harbor officially began. Even then, Yamamoto still faced several major challenges. Like Taranto Harbor, Pearl Harbor was relatively shallow, creating a serious problem for the torpedo bombers that would carry out the main attack against the American battleships. Normally, when an aircraft dropped a torpedo, it plunged more than 100 feet below the surface before leveling out and heading toward its target. At Pearl Harbor, that meant most torpedoes would simply bury themselves in the muddy bottom instead of striking enemy ships, since parts of the harbor were less than 100 feet deep. The Americans were so confident that aerial torpedoes could not operate effectively in such shallow water that they never even installed torpedo nets around their battleships. At Taranto, the British had solved this problem by flying their slow biplanes extremely low, allowing the torpedoes to enter the water gently and avoid diving too deep. But Japan's faster monoplane torpedo bombers could not safely use the same method. Eventually, Japanese engineers developed an ingenious answer by attaching specially designed wooden fins to the noses and tails of the torpedoes. These simple modifications reduced how deeply the torpedoes dived after entering the water, allowing them to run successfully through Pearl Harbor's shallow depths. With the greatest technical challenge finally solved, Yamamoto's plan moved one step closer to reality, while the United States Navy remained completely unaware of the danger approaching. Beginning in April 1941, pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy started practicing simulated attacks against American warships. With every training mission, they gained valuable experience that was used to refine the overall battle plan. To help perfect every detail, Japanese naval commanders built a massive-scale model of Pearl Harbor where they could rehearse the operation repeatedly. But to make the plan truly effective, they needed accurate intelligence. That responsibility fell to Takeo Yoshikawa, a young Japanese naval officer sent to Oahu as a spy. Despite having no more access than an ordinary tourist, Yoshikawa gathered an astonishing amount of information about the American fleet and the airfields protecting it simply by carefully observing them. Thanks to Oahu's large Japanese-American population, he attracted very little suspicion. He often sat inside a tea house overlooking the harbor, quietly watching daily activity while using his remarkable knowledge of American warships to build a detailed picture of their routines. Perhaps his most famous mission came when he disguised himself as a tourist and hired a sightseeing airplane to secretly photograph Pearl Harbor from above. Every piece of information he collected was sent back to Tokyo, where it became a key part of the final attack plan. As planning entered its final stages, Japan also decided to include two-man midget submarines in the operation. Their mission was to slip quietly into Pearl Harbor and fire torpedoes at American warships while the crews were distracted by the air attack taking place overhead. The completed plan called for 6 aircraft carriers to secretly approach north of Oahu before launching their aircraft just before dawn, catching the American base completely by surprise. 2 waves of planes would strike first, each assigned specific targets before returning to their carriers to rearm. Afterward, a 3rd wave would launch to destroy any surviving ships and remaining military facilities, leaving Pearl Harbor completely crippled. Some Japanese leaders even wanted to take the operation a step further by invading Hawaii itself, believing both Hawaii and the Philippines could be captured at the same time. In the end, however, that ambitious idea was abandoned. Even in early November, leaders on both sides still hoped a last-minute agreement might prevent war. On November 20, Japan presented what it believed would be its final proposal to avoid conflict with both the United States and the British Empire. Tokyo offered to withdraw from Indochina and stop expanding into Southeast Asia if America agreed to remove its harsh economic sanctions and provide 1 million gallons of aviation fuel. Washington rejected the proposal, instead demanding that Japan completely withdraw from mainland China. For Japan's leaders, that condition was impossible to accept. At that moment, they became convinced that war could no longer be avoided. Meanwhile, Yamamoto was already assembling his massive combined fleet of aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. The force included 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 2 battleships, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers, 23 fleet submarines, and 5 midget submarines. At the center of the fleet stood 6 powerful aircraft carriers under the command of Admiral Nagumo. Together, they carried more than 400 aircraft prepared for the coming attack. Commanding the operation from the battleship Nagato, Yamamoto ordered the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled to leave port on November 26, 1941, as diplomacy continued falling apart. The lifelong gambler understood that this first gamble would also be his greatest and most dangerous. Everything depended on achieving complete surprise. Surely, he thought, with tensions already so high between Tokyo and Washington, the Americans would notice such a massive fleet disappearing and begin searching for it. If they discovered the task force sailing toward Hawaii, they could quickly understand Japan's intentions and send their own ships and aircraft to intercept. The Japanese fleet still had nearly 12,000 miles to travel, a journey expected to take almost 2 weeks if everything went according to plan. During that time, a single American ship or reconnaissance aircraft could expose the entire operation. Although the vast Pacific Ocean offered some protection, Yamamoto refused to take unnecessary risks. He ordered the fleet to maintain absolute radio silence, receiving only coded messages from Japan because he feared any outgoing transmission might be intercepted. Far ahead of the main force, Japanese submarines searched the surrounding waters for American ships that might accidentally cross the fleet's path. On the American side, however, intelligence officers remained far more focused on the Philippines. They intercepted a growing number of Japanese military communications across Asia, although their true meaning often remained unclear. Observers in the Far East also noticed Japanese warships moving out to sea during the opening days of December, as Japan prepared for its sweeping offensive across Asia and the Pacific. As a result, the United States correctly expected an attack on the Philippines, but completely failed to detect the part of Japan's plan aimed directly at Pearl Harbor. Less than 24 hours after Yamamoto's fleet sailed, warning messages were sent to every American force across the Pacific. However, the instructions explaining exactly what commanders should do remained unclear. Similar warnings continued arriving over the following days, and although they should have raised serious concern, their constant repetition had the opposite effect. As Admiral William Halsey, whose name would soon become legendary in the Pacific War, later explained, there were so many warnings that people gradually became numb to them and stopped treating them as urgent. Even though military leaders believed the Philippines would be Japan's first target, Admiral Kimmel still did what he could to strengthen Pearl Harbor's defenses. His task, however, was made far more difficult because many of his long-range patrol aircraft had already been transferred to the Atlantic, leaving him without enough planes to monitor the vast ocean surrounding Oahu. Instead, he focused his remaining aircraft on watching the sea routes leading into Pearl Harbor and the areas where American warships regularly trained. His greatest concern was that Japanese submarines would attack once war began. Unfortunately, that decision also helped Yamamoto's fleet approach Hawaii without being detected. Farther inland, Lieutenant General Walter C. Short of the U.S. Army interpreted the warnings from Washington very differently. Rather than expecting a direct military assault, he believed the greater danger came from possible sabotage by members of Hawaii's Japanese immigrant community. Acting on that assumption, he tightened security around the island's airfields, even parking aircraft close together so they would be easier to guard. Many of the soldiers carrying out these orders found the decision difficult to understand. They personally knew many of the local Japanese families and could not imagine them taking part in sabotage or supporting an attack against the United States. The Army and Navy's separate responses exposed a major weakness in Oahu's defenses. There was no single commander responsible for coordinating every American force stationed on the island. Combined with the unclear warnings, the relaxed attitude toward them, and the widespread belief that Japan would strike the Philippines first, almost nobody expected Pearl Harbor itself to come under attack. As a result, several defensive measures that might have reduced the impact of a surprise assault were never taken. Without realizing it, the Americans had left the door wide open for Yamamoto's strike force. On December 2, 1941, aboard the battleship Nagato anchored in Hiroshima Bay, Yamamoto ordered a coded message to be transmitted to the attack fleet. It read, "Climb Mount Niitaka." That single phrase officially authorized the assault on Pearl Harbor. From the beginning, Yamamoto had insisted that the operation's greatest objective was destroying the 3 American aircraft carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet, the US Enterprise, US Saratoga, and US Lexington. But because aircraft carriers served as mobile airbases during a growing international crisis, they became extremely active in the final days before war, making it increasingly unlikely they would all be found together. The Saratoga was already back in the United States, undergoing a major overhaul, guaranteeing it would not be present on December 7. That left only the Enterprise and Lexington. On November 28, the Enterprise departed Pearl Harbor to transport 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters to Wake Island. Then, only 2 days before the attack, the Lexington also left port to deliver aircraft to Midway Island. As the Japanese fleet closed in, commanders realized with disappointment that none of the American carriers would be waiting in Pearl Harbor. Eliminating those ships had always been the main purpose of the attack, because they posed the greatest long-term threat to Japan's chances of victory. After risking everything to reach Hawaii unnoticed, Japan discovered its most valuable targets were no longer there. Even so, the mission moved forward. Destroying the battleships and other warships still anchored in the harbor would deliver a devastating blow and weaken the United States before the surviving carriers could later be confronted by Japan's superior naval strength. During the evening of December 6, 1941, in the final hours before war, American codebreakers intercepted a sudden surge of Japanese military messages crossing the Pacific. Without seeing the complete picture, intelligence officers believed the expected attacks would fall on Southeast Asia and the Philippines. Although a warning was prepared, it failed to reach Pearl Harbor before dawn broke over Oahu 3:45 a.m. On the northern coast of Oahu, an alarm clock rang inside the tent, shared by Privates George E. Elliott, Jr. and Joseph L. Lockard. It was not an emergency signal, but simply the start of another routine workday. The 2 soldiers climbed out of bed and headed to their radar station at Opana, one of 6 mobile radar sites positioned around Oahu to provide the widest possible coverage of the surrounding skies. Located more than 500 feet above sea level, the station gave their SCRAR 270 radar an excellent view across the Pacific Ocean. Although they remained on duty around the clock, the radar itself operated only between 4 and 7 each morning, mainly for training rather than active defense. The rest of their shift was spent maintaining the equipment or protecting the site from vandals and curious visitors. Unlike the rotating radar screens familiar today, this early system used an oscilloscope that displayed sharp spikes whenever it detected something in the sky. It could reveal that an object was approaching, but it could not identify what it was. 3:57 a.m. Off the coast of Oahu, one of the few American warships already at sea, was the Wicks-class destroyer US Ward, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William W. Outerbridge, who had taken command only 2 days earlier. Lookouts aboard the Ward noticed the nearby minesweeper US Condor, signaling that its crew believed they had spotted a submarine periscope breaking the surface. In response, Outerbridge immediately ordered his ship to begin searching the area for what could be a Japanese submarine. 6 a.m. Far to the north, The first wave of Japanese aircraft lifted off from their carriers under the command of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. The strike force consisted of 183 aircraft, divided into 3 separate groups. 2 formations were assigned to attack the airfields surrounding Pearl Harbor, clearing the way for the main force to strike Battleship Row. At the same moment aboard the battleship Oost Nevada, Ensign Joseph K. Taussig Jr. woke to begin his morning watch. Serving as officer of the deck on a peaceful Sunday in port was usually uneventful, and searching for something useful to do, he realized that only one boiler had been operating since the ship entered Pearl Harbor. Deciding it would keep both himself and the crew occupied, he ordered a second boiler to be lit 6:30 a.m. More aircraft rose into the morning sky, but these were not Japanese. Over 200 miles west of Pearl Harbor, the American aircraft carrier USS Enterprise launched 18 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers. The carrier was originally supposed to have arrived back at Pearl Harbor the previous day, but stormy weather had delayed its return by 24 hours. The dive bombers were ordered to patrol the surrounding area before continuing on to land at Ford Island, completely unaware that they were flying toward one of the most devastating attacks in American history. 6:37 a.m. Lookouts aboard the USS Ward spot another American vessel, the Navy supply ship Antares, heading toward the entrance of Pearl Harbor while towing a 500-ton barge. The Antares is waiting for a tugboat that is supposed to take over the tow. When the tug fails to appear on schedule, the ship turns east to keep the harbor entrance clear until help arrives. As it changes course, crew members notice a narrow white wake trailing behind them. They quickly realize it is a submarine periscope and immediately signal its position to the USS Ward. Believing an attack may already be underway, Lieutenant Commander Outerbridge orders General Quarters and Races to intercept the submarine. A nearby P.B. Catalina flying boat dives toward the scene, dropping smoke markers to identify the target. The Ward fires its 4-inch guns before speeding ahead and releasing depth charges, destroying the Japanese midget submarine and killing both crew members aboard. Outerbridge immediately sends a coded report to Pearl Harbor describing the encounter. However, delays in decoding the message mean it reaches Admiral Kimmel much later, who first demands confirmation that the report is genuine and not simply a false alarm. 7 a.m. Completely unaware of the events unfolding offshore, Privates George Elliott and Joseph Lockard are finishing their shift at the Opana radar station and looking forward to breakfast after the relief crew arrives. Elliott, still new to the unit, has spent most of the morning at the plotting table, marking any aircraft detected by Lockard's radar onto a map before reporting them to headquarters. Although nothing unusual has appeared so far. While waiting for the truck to take them back to base, the 2 soldiers decide to continue practicing. This time, Elliott operates the oscilloscope while Lockard guides him through the exercise. At first, the radar displays only a flat line, just as it had throughout most of the morning. Then, without warning, a huge signal suddenly appears. Lockard studies the display and is stunned by the size of the spike, indicating a formation of aircraft far larger than anything he has ever seen. The 2 immediately telephone Fort Shafter in Honolulu to report what they have found. Their call reaches Private Joseph McDonald, who searches for Lieutenant Kermit Tyler in the plotting room. Tyler dismisses the report, leaving Lockard completely astonished. He insists they are tracking a massive group of aircraft heading directly toward Oahu. Hearing the concern in Lockard's voice, McDonald urges Tyler to speak with him personally. Even then, Tyler calmly explains that the radar operators should ignore the contact, because he believes it is simply the scheduled arrival of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers flying in from the mainland to Wheeler Field. Lockard, Elliott, and McDonald all remain uneasy, but they have no choice except to obey their superiors' instructions. Only minutes later, after being relieved from duty, McDonald walks back to his tent with a troubled look on his face. When another soldier asks him what is wrong, he quietly replies, "The Japs are coming." 7:26 a.m. The destroyer USS Helm leaves its mooring to begin a routine day of maintenance on navigation buoys positioned throughout Pearl Harbor and the surrounding waters, about 7:40 a.m. Elliott and Lockhart lose the radar contact they had been tracking for more than 30 minutes. Shortly afterward, a truck arrives to return them to their base. Just as they climb aboard, the sound of explosions echoes across Oahu 7:48 a.m. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida gives the order for the attack to begin as sailors throughout the Pacific Fleet slowly wake on what had seemed like another quiet Sunday morning. The skies above Pearl Harbor suddenly fill with the roar of aircraft engines. Even now, many Americans remain completely unaware of the danger, assuming the planes belong to the U.S. Army or Navy carrying out routine training exercises. On ships like the USS Nevada, military bands continue playing as crews prepare for the morning flag-raising ceremony. Only when the first bombs explode do they finally understand the truth. The Japanese have achieved complete surprise. Battleship Row immediately becomes the main target. The USS Oklahoma is struck by 2 torpedoes that tear open its hull and cause severe flooding. Only minutes later, a third torpedo slams into the battleship, bringing it close to capsizing. During the opening moments of the assault, the USS West Virginia suffers 7 hits from specially modified Type 91 torpedoes, while almost at the same time the USS California is struck twice. Then, the Japanese level bombers arrive overhead. Around 10 bombers attack the USS Arizona, dropping modified 1,760-pound armor, piercing bombs with devastating accuracy. One bomb explodes near the ship's ammunition magazines, triggering a catastrophic blast that effectively tears the battleship apart. Nearby, the heavy cruiser USS Helena is hit by a torpedo after the attacking pilot mistakes it for Admiral Kimmel's flagship, the battleship USS Pennsylvania, in the early morning light. The explosion also damages the minellayer USS Oglala, which quickly begins taking on water. Efforts to save the ship are repeatedly interrupted by Japanese fighters sweeping in to strafe the rescue crews. Another cruiser, the USS Raleigh, also takes a torpedo hit and begins listing heavily as water pours inside. American sailors immediately rush to their battle stations and open fire, managing to shoot down several Japanese aircraft. But the tightly packed ships along Battleship Row make aiming extremely dangerous, as stray bullets could easily strike neighboring vessels. On many ships, ammunition supplies are exhausted within minutes, forcing desperate crews to race below deck for more shells and cartridges. As if the situation were not already disastrous, American fighter resistance over Pearl Harbor remains so weak that Japanese Zero fighters begin strafing the defensive gun crews themselves. Farther inland, while bombs continue exploding around the harbor, the Army airfields at Barbers Point, Bellows, Hickam, and Wheeler also come under heavy attack. Bombs fall directly among the aircraft that had been parked wingtip to guard against possible sabotage, causing enormous destruction. At Wheeler Field, pilots such as Lieutenant Phil Rasmussen are still wearing their pajamas as they grab whatever weapons they can find and fire into the sky at the attacking aircraft. During a brief pause in the assault, Rasmussen and the other pilots inspect the airfield. Many of their P-38 and P-40 fighters are already burning, yet a handful have somehow escaped damage. Working as fast as possible, they arm and refuel those surviving aircraft before taking off to fight back. Despite facing overwhelming odds, flying an older P-36 that was outclassed by the Japanese Zero and struggling with a jammed machine gun, Rasmussen still succeeds in shooting down one enemy fighter. Altogether, the pilots from Wheeler Field destroy 11 Japanese aircraft, but compared with the size of the attacking force, it is only a tiny success against an overwhelming assault. In the middle of the attack, the SBD dive bombers from the USS Enterprise arrive over Pearl Harbor and are stunned by the destruction unfolding below. Almost instantly, they come under fire, not only from Japanese fighters, but also from American anti-aircraft gunners, who mistake them for the similar-looking Japanese carrier bombers. Before they can safely land, 7 of the American aircraft are shot down. Soon afterward, the B-17 Flying Fortress bombers that Lieutenant Tyler had been expecting also reach Oahu. They too are caught in the chaos, coming under attack from both Japanese pilots and nervous American gunners. Several bombers are damaged, and with Hickam Field already under heavy assault, many are forced to divert and land at nearby airfields instead. 8:17 a.m. The destroyer US Helm, originally assigned to carry out routine maintenance on the harbor's navigation buoys, now turns toward the harbor entrance as the attack continues. As the ship reaches open water, where it has more room to maneuver, one of the lookouts spots an object stuck on a nearby reef. It is quickly identified as one of Japan's two-man midget submarines. Turning sharply to starboard, the helm opens fire but fails to hit the tiny submarine, which manages to slip away. Its escape, however, is short-lived. The submarine soon runs aground on the reef once again. Realizing there is no way out, the two crew members abandon their vessel. One drowns while trying to escape, while the other, Kazuo Sakamaki, is captured alive, becoming the first Japanese prisoner of war held by the United States. 8:27 a.m. Shortly before the attack began, the destroyer US Monahan had been ordered to leave Pearl Harbor and assist the US Ward. As it heads toward the harbor entrance, it comes under heavy attack. While trying to reach open water, the crew spots another Japanese midget submarine attempting to strike the American fleet. The captain immediately orders full speed ahead, hoping to ram it. The destroyer narrowly misses by only 50 yards before dropping depth charges into the shallow water. The explosions are so powerful that they lift the stern of the Monahan out of the water, damaging its steering gear. With the ship temporarily out of control, it crashes into a nearby barge, though fortunately the damage is only minor. 8:30 a.m. On board the destroyer US Aylwin, sailors scramble to get the ship underway before it becomes an easy target. Much of the crew, including every senior officer, is still ashore when the destroyer pulls away from the dock with less than half of its normal crew aboard. Command falls to Ensign Stanley B. Kaplan, a young officer who has been at sea for barely 8 months. Now, in the middle of a full-scale attack, he suddenly finds himself commanding a destroyer under enemy fire. Shortly after the ship gets moving, lookouts spot the captain and several officers racing toward them in a small motor launch. But Kaplan has already been ordered not to stop or even slow down, forced to leave them behind. He continues out to sea while his gunners fire at Japanese aircraft overhead. During his very first command at sea, after nearly 45 minutes of relentless bombing and strafing, Battleship Row is left engulfed in flames. The first wave of Japanese aircraft finishes its mission and turns back toward the carriers. But the attack is far from over. The second wave is already approaching. 8:40 a.m. Despite suffering a torpedo hit that causes severe flooding, the battleship US Nevada manages to build enough steam to get underway, thanks to Ensign Joseph Tausig's earlier decision to light a second boiler. A process that normally would have taken 2 hours is completed in just 40 minutes. Breaking free from its moorings, the Nevada becomes the only battleship able to leave Battleship Row, no longer an easy target sitting motionless in the harbor. 8:54 a.m. The second wave of the Japanese assault arrives, made up of 35 fighters, 78 dive bombers, and 54 high-altitude bombers. This time, however, the Americans are fully alert and fight back with everything they have. Most of the Japanese aircraft lost on December 7 are shot down during this second wave because the attackers no longer have the advantage of complete surprise. Admiral Nagumo carefully watches these growing losses. 9:50 a.m. While desperately trying to fight off repeated dive bomber attacks and reach open water, the US Nevada is struck by 5 Japanese 250-kilogram bombs. The Japanese are determined to sink the battleship inside the narrow channel leading into Pearl Harbor, hoping its wreck will block both the entrance and exit, making the disaster even worse for the Americans. Although the bombs inflict heavy damage, they fail to sink the ship. Instead, they ignite massive fires that become just as dangerous to the exhausted crew as the enemy aircraft overhead. 10:00 a.m. Having dropped their bombs, fired their ammunition, launched their torpedoes, and burned through most of their fuel, the last Japanese aircraft begin returning to their carriers. Many pilots expect to quickly arm for a planned third wave of attacks. Instead, they are disappointed to learn that Admiral Nagumo has canceled the operation. In his view, nearly every major objective, except destroying the American aircraft carriers, had already been achieved. Since the Americans were now fully prepared for another attack, sending in a third wave would only cost valuable pilots and aircraft, resources Japan could not afford to lose before the inevitable battle against the surviving American carriers. Once every aircraft has safely landed back aboard the carriers, Nagumo orders the fleet to withdraw. Of the roughly 350 aircraft launched that morning, only 29 are lost, a remarkably small price considering the devastating damage they had inflicted. 10:30 a.m. Despite the extraordinary efforts of the crew aboard the US Nevada, the fires started by the bomb hits prevent damage control teams from fully containing the flooding. Fearing the battleship will eventually sink, the crew receives orders to deliberately beach the ship along Ford Island. Assisted by a tugboat and a small minesweeper, the Nevada is guided onto the shoreline at Hospital Point, where it comes to rest, battered, burning, and no longer able to move. President Roosevelt was informed about the attack on Pearl Harbor shortly after it began. Because of the time difference between Oahu and Washington, it was already early afternoon when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox rushed into a meeting Roosevelt was holding with his advisor, Harry Hopkins, to deliver the shocking news that Japan was attacking Pearl Harbor. Looking back on that historic day, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt recalled how her husband remained remarkably calm as he listened to the updates. But she knew beneath that calm exterior, he was furious. After everything he had done to avoid war and reach a peaceful solution with Japan, the attack was a bitter blow. Even more infuriating was the way Japan had chosen to begin the conflict. An astonishing 7.5 hours after the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Japan finally delivered its declaration of war against the United States and Great Britain. Among the leaders Roosevelt immediately spoke with was British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had also learned that Britain was now at war with Japan. At the same time Pearl Harbor was under attack, Japanese forces were striking British territories across the Far East, including Hong Kong. During their conversation, Churchill summed up the situation with one simple remark: "We are all in the same boat now." As Roosevelt considered what lay ahead, he quietly admitted to Eleanor that he believed Germany would soon stand beside its Japanese ally and declare war on the United States as well. Echoing the same fears Yamamoto had expressed from the opposite side of the conflict, Roosevelt admitted that America was not yet ready for the war it had suddenly entered. He explained that the country's factories would need time to shift from producing cars and refrigerators to building tanks, aircraft, and bombs. Because of that, he told Eleanor that America would likely, in his own words, have to take a good many defeats before we can have a victory. Armed with that understanding, Eleanor Roosevelt delivered her weekly radio broadcast later that evening. Speaking to millions of Americans who were shocked, frightened, and angry, she offered words of confidence and hope, declaring, "Whatever is asked of us, we shall accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the USA." While Eleanor encouraged the nation over the radio, President Roosevelt sat with his secretary, Grace Tully, preparing the speech he would deliver to Congress the following day. Later that evening, he met with his cabinet to review the latest reports arriving from Pearl Harbor. The news grew worse with every update. Casualty numbers continued to climb, and with so many warships either damaged or sunk, the Pacific Fleet had suffered a devastating blow in the opening hours of the war. The one piece of encouraging news was that all of America's aircraft carriers had escaped the attack. After a restless night, Roosevelt appeared before Congress at 12:30 p.m. on December 8. He declared that, because of Japan's unprovoked and treacherous attack on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war already existed between the United States and the Empire of Japan. Less than an hour later, Congress overwhelmingly approved a declaration of war. Only one representative voted against it: Jeannette Rankin of Montana, the first woman ever elected to the United States Congress. Despite being loudly booed and criticized by many of her fellow lawmakers, Rankin refused to change her vote. Explaining her decision, she simply said, "As a woman, I can't go to war. And I refuse to send anyone else." Back at Pearl Harbor, the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise sailed into the harbor on the afternoon of December 8. As its crew looked across the shattered harbor, they witnessed the destruction they had narrowly avoided themselves. The previous day, the carrier had launched aircraft to search for the Japanese fleet after a possible sighting. But the mission found nothing. Now determined to strike back, or at the very least avoid being caught helpless in another attack, the crew worked tirelessly to refuel, rearm, and prepare the carrier for another mission at sea as reports of Japan's invasion of the Philippines spread throughout the Pacific. One thought united Americans everywhere, whether they were serving overseas, living in Hawaii, or back home on the mainland. They wanted only one thing: to avenge Pearl Harbor. The attack claimed the lives of 2,335 American service members and 68 civilians, while another 1,178 people were wounded. Japan sank 4 battleships and severely damaged 4 more, along with several cruisers and other supporting vessels. Nearly 390 American aircraft were also destroyed. Yet despite the enormous losses, the survival of the American aircraft carriers proved decisive. In the end, the attack gave Japan only the 6 months Yamamoto believed were necessary to defeat the Allies. That victory, however, never came. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, 4 of the same Japanese carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor were destroyed by American naval aviation. It was a crushing defeat from which Japan would never fully recover and marked the beginning of the empire's long road to defeat in 1945. Pearl Harbor left a permanent mark on the United States long after World War II ended. As the Cold War with the Soviet Union began, American leaders constantly feared another surprise attack, this time involving nuclear weapons. In response, the United States invested billions of dollars in early warning systems, radar networks, and intelligence programs designed to prevent another strategic surprise. At the same time, it launched a massive military buildup to ensure that, unlike on December 7, 1941, the country would always be prepared for any future conflict. Determined to avoid repeating the mistakes of the 1930s, the United States also adopted a far more assertive foreign policy to contain Soviet expansion than it had ever used against Japan before the Second World War. Even after all the lessons learned from the war, historians continue to debate whether the United States should have recognized the warning signs before the attack. Were important clues simply overlooked, or, as some have argued, deliberately ignored? Like many major moments in history, Pearl Harbor has inspired countless conspiracy theories, ranging from reasonable questions to extraordinary claims. The most persistent of them all asks whether President Roosevelt knew about the attack before December 7 and chose not to stop it. What can be said with complete certainty is that Pearl Harbor was far more than an attack on a naval base. In a single morning, it changed the course of world history. It brought the United States into the Second World War and helped shape its rise into what is now widely regarded as the world's most influential, and arguably its most powerful, nation.